Now let's build a little more background knowledge regarding the depth of knowledge, revise Bloom's taxonomy, and Karen Hess's cognitive rigor matrix as our guides to cognitive rigor. Cognitive rigor is simply the kind and level of thinking required of a student to meet a learning goal. Webb's DOK defines the cognitive demand. How deeply do you have to understand the content to successfully interact with it? How complex is the content? The DOK model employed to analyze the cognitive expectations demanded by standards, curricular activities, and assessments. DOK is about complexity of thinking. The revised Bloom's taxonomy is the tool that we use in Westminster Public Schools for cognitive process. What type of thinking is needed to complete the task? The two models are brought together with the Karen Hess cognitive matrices, which determine different ways to interact with content. In this slide, this is the tool that our teachers in Westminster Public Schools use as their guiding document as they identified the cognitive process and depth of knowledge for each one of our steps within the district proficiency scales. You'll find copies of these within the folder on your playlist. On this slide, you'll see the first two images that appear if you do a Google search on the topic of DOK. We guided our teachers away from this as a primary tool to determine the cognitive demand, as the verb is not always the clear answer to the complexity of thinking. Depth of knowledge levels. The first is recall and reproduction. In this one, your key indicator is that there's typically one right answer. The next level is basic application of skills and concepts. Here, you typically see more than one mental or cognitive process being employed, but there is still only one correct answer. DOK3 is strategic thinking. Here, there's typically more than one possible correct answer, and it requires some decision-making or justification. The final level, DOK4, is extended thinking. This requires connecting across disciplines, content areas, and accessing multiple sources, similar to the items that we are seeing on the new PARCC assessment. For example, the intended student learning outcomes determines the DOK level. Ask yourself what level of complexity of thinking is required. While verbs may appear to point to a DOK level, it is what comes after the verb that is the best indicator of the rigor or DOK level. In the next three examples, you're going to see the verb describe used at 3 DOK levels. In DOK 1, describe the 3 characteristics of metamorphic rocks. This is simple recall. In this next example, we're looking at a DOK 2. Describe the difference between metamorphic and igneous rocks. This requires additional cognitive processing to determine the difference in the two rock types. Here we have DOK 3. Describe a model that you might use to represent the relationships that exist within the rock cycle. Provide evidence to support your decision. This requires deep understanding of the rock cycle and a determination of how best to represent it by providing evidence. Karen Hess's cognitive rigor matrix helps teachers plan instructional strategies that assure the cognitive demand and the cognitive thinking align with the learning experience. Some things to consider. Let's take a look at the depth of knowledge levels. DOK and Bloom's taxonomy are different. The DOK level is not determined by the verb, but rather the context in which the verb is used and the complexity of thinking required. For example, to create a clay model of a cell is a DOK level 2. You are simply recalling and identifying the parts of a cell. The verb create can be misleading. Though creating is at the highest level in the Bloom's taxonomy, it still depends on what the standard is requiring a student to do. If a student is required to create a design model to solve a practical problem related to cells, then the task described is at a higher complexity than just creating and labeling a clay model, even though the verb is still create. So the important learning here is that even though a verb may be at a higher level of cognitive thinking, the actual task assigned needs to be analyzed to determine the required depth of knowledge. The next few slides, you're going to see some examples of the Hess cognitive rigor matrices, which combine Bloom's revised taxonomy and the depth of knowledge in one table. This is not a crosswalk between these two classification tools. It's not to be used as a rubric. It's rather a tool to jointly classify learning targets and assessment. They're available in a variety of content areas, including reading, math, science, writing, social studies, world language, and fine arts. These tools were used as a key identifier for each one of the DOK and cognitive processes identified on the proficiency scales. So we want you to experience this process one time on your own, but you'll see as you go to each one of the proficiency scales, teams of teachers worked over an 8-month period to define the cognitive process and depth of knowledge for each one of our steps. We believe it's important for you to understand the process so that when you come to one that you have a disagreement with, that you have the understanding to dig deep into it and have good questions of why it might be that.
As teachers, we unpack standards or deconstruct standards. When we deconstruct a statement of intended learning, we break it into its component parts. Deconstructing means determining what students need to know, the knowledge, concepts, or content, and what cognitive process students need to engage, at what level of rigor. Take a look at the standard on your screen. In the blue ovals, you'll see two verbs that are highlighted, describe and drawing. The first thing I did there was take a look at the revised Bloom's taxonomy and identify the cognitive process. The cognitive process that I identified was understand category because the student was required to construct meaning from instructional messages. The next thing I did was analyze the noun and the noun phrases. The noun and the noun phrase in this standard are underlined. The nouns are character, setting, or event. They have to describe the character, setting, or event. They have to draw on specific details in the text. If you obtain your Karen-Hess cognitive rigor matrix, you can see on the left side is the cognitive process. Go to where it says understand. Within the understand row, identify the correct depth of knowledge. What depth of knowledge level is most appropriate based on the standard requirements? The depth of knowledge I selected for this particular standard is the DOK level 2, because the complexity of thinking requires a student to imply more than one mental process or cognitive step, but there is still one right answer. Try this on your own. Please follow the directions on your playlist.